Wow, there's a lot happening with immigration right now. So we've got ICE raids happening in cities across the country with Fox News, Kristi Noem, and apparently even Dr. Phil gleefully tagging along.
But you've never been deported before?
We Dr. Phil. We got Dr. Phil.
Yeah? How do you know me?
Donald Trump announced today that he wants to send tens of thousands of migrant detainees to Guantanamo Bay. He also signed legislation into law that allows for the deportation of immigrants who have been accused of nonviolent crimes. And garbage person in charge, Tom Homan, has pledged to get around all sanctuary cities and states to purge the nation of all 11 million undocumented persons. Welcome to the jungle. UNFTR. Trump's vision is gut-wrenching and dystopian, and there are a lot of people rooting for it, even some people who you might otherwise not expect. So to help set the table for how complicated this narrative is, take a look at this clip.
This is very bad that they have these people here. They taking our money, they taking our food stamps, they taking our jobs, they taking our streets over, and they bringing more police, and we don't need police over here. We fine the way we are. Take them back, Trump.
This is what losing control of the narrative looks and sounds like, and why brushing up on the facts is so vital. That's a Bronx resident commenting to camera crews covering roundups in his neighborhood. It's not Stephen Miller or Tom Homan. It's a person of color who lives in an area being targeted by ICE as we speak. I offer this as a reminder that nothing is black and white, and as we'll discover, oftentimes left-right narratives are both misguided. One of the hard questions that I recently posed to the UNFTR audience was, what are you willing to do beyond hashtag resistance, especially when it comes to immigration? For example, are you willing to shelter an undocumented person in your community who's in danger of being swept up by ICE? It's easier said than done, but it's an example of how I think we're going to be tested. To illustrate how difficult and painful this is, I want to share some listener feedback that put me on my heels this morning as I was prepping for this piece. Quote, "The hotline is launched. ICE has their orders. And today, we watched in horror as 2 homes were raided in our neighborhood. I can't stop it. I don't know their immigration status. Now a family is in shambles, and I am pretty sure the loud and proud MAGA neighbor with a 'I voted for the felon' sticker on his truck called and reported them. I mean, who else fucking would? Who the fuck could? My husband told me he's scared that they will come for him. We have documents ready if that day comes, but it is 1 week in. The lump in my throat won't go away. It will never happen rings as the familiar excuse in my head as the silence is deafening. Tonight I mourn for the families. I apologize for the misguided hate. I'm mortified to be an American." It's hard to know where and how to step in. So in just these 2 examples, we have a person of color in a targeted neighborhood cheering on deportations and a well-intentioned person who wants to step in but is unclear as to what the right move is. So my goal today is to encourage you to do neither yet, not until we get the narrative down. We have to commit ourselves to learning the issue inside and out because we're all being given bad information from Democrats, Republicans, mainstream media, and even some well-intentioned online pundits that you may follow. This is a difficult issue, so the least we can do, if we're going to share opinions on the matter or get involved, is to get it right. Let's start with some basics. When immigration and deportation figures are tracked by the U.S. government, they're broken out in a few ways. Now, the first concept is something that we've covered before, net international migration, or NIM, and it's pretty straightforward. You take foreign-born immigration, subtract foreign-born emigration, so inflow versus outflow, add net Puerto Rican migration, and factor in babies born to immigrants in the United States, and there's our figure. Now, NIM has been relatively stable over decades, and it's a good thing that we're in positive territory, especially with declining birth rates and boomers retiring. I mean, so far, right now at least, we still do have jobs and roles to fill in this economy and society. So put another way, you'd rather be accepting net new people than losing existing ones because it's an indication of economic strength and political stability, believe it or not. So that's the big headline number, NIM. And despite the rhetoric, it doesn't move all that much, but I'll pinpoint the moment that it did, and it might surprise you. Now, in terms of criminality, I'll let you internet sleuths find the myriad studies that concretely demonstrate how immigrants commit crime in this country at a much lower rate than citizens who were born here. Sorry, white nationalist pricks, dem's the facts. Now, speaking of facts and figures, the figures to watch over the coming months are apprehensions and removals and returns. Now, removals and returns together comprise total deportations, which is really the headline number that is usually reported. But the removal and return numbers tell the actual story. In terms of apprehensions, it's important to clarify that these are the total number of people who are stopped or apprehended coming into the country and then turned away. The vast majority of them are at the US-Mexico border. Then there is a fraction, and I mean fraction, that elude capture and sneak across undetected. And we only know of these because we pick them up in census data down the road. So at any given time, over the past few decades, apprehensions is the big number that is reported by the media with the expected biases attached, and it's not a good number. For example, in Obama's last year in office, there were only 530,000 apprehensions. Contrast this with Bush's last year in 2008, when there were over 1 million apprehensions. So depending upon the media reporting bias, this can go two ways, and in fact it did. Conservative outlets blasted Obama for the net reduction in apprehensions, claiming he was soft on immigration. Now, on the surface, this seems kind of right. I mean, it's almost half. But let's think about what was happening at the time. In 2008, the U.S. economy had yet to collapse, and Mexico was still suffering from the effects of NAFTA. As a result, more people were attempting to cross into the United States to find work. But by 2016, Mexico had turned its economy around, and the United States was still recovering from the financial crisis in 2009. So the reason the apprehension number was halved under Obama is because fewer people were trying to get here. Nevertheless, conservative media was able to portray Obama as soft, and the establishment liberal media claimed Obama was simply more effective. In reality, the delta between total apprehensions and returns, the people who try to enter the country and are turned away, contributes to the NIM figure but never tells the whole story. But the figure generally fluctuates between 100 and 200,000. These are the people that enter into the system with cases before immigration officials and the courts. But let's stay with Obama and open up the narrative. Why then do so many people, particularly on the left, refer to Obama as the deporter in chief? This is where the real story behind the numbers comes into play. So let's go back to the two figures that truly matter: removals and returns. Looking at the final years of Clinton, Bush, and Obama, we see an interesting trend in terms of enforcement and deportation. So, in 2000, Clinton's final year in office, the number of removals was around 188,000. These were undocumented people living within the United States that were rounded up and deported to their home countries for a variety of reasons. Overstaying a visa, in the criminal justice system, or perhaps just released from the system, wrong place, wrong time. For whatever reason, these people were forced to leave the country and existed outside of immigration norms from temporary status, temporary protected status, work visas, student visas, agricultural or tech visas, etc. So now, in 2008, at the end of Bush's second term, the figure essentially doubled to 359,000. But this was the result of better tracking, more resources, a post-9/11 intolerance for migrants, and Clinton-era policies that actually trapped more people inside the United States, which I'll address in a moment. At the end of Obama's term in 2016, this figure was relatively stable at 344,000, but during his term, it reached a high of 434,000, and it hasn't been matched since, yet. So all told, Obama removed 1 million more people from the United States than Bush and 2.2 million more than Clinton. That's why he earned the nickname. Of course, the interesting part about left-right narratives is that Democrats didn't want this information to be known, but neither did conservatives. So the narrative that endured was the one surrounding attempts. Hey everybody, thanks for taking the time to watch the video today. If you're already subscribed to the channel, good on you. Like this video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, if you could do so, it really helps us on our quest for world domination. Also, if you like good things that are free, every week we produce a free weekly newsletter for leftists and progressives. Go to unftr.com to sign up today and you won't be disappointed. The fascinating thing about NIM historically is that it used to flow naturally. People would come, people would go. Seasonal workers would cross the border for harvest seasons and return home. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, at least better than now. That is, until Bill Clinton decided to criminalize existence itself. In 1996, Clinton dropped 2 nuclear bombs on immigration, an anti-terrorism act that targeted migrants in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, which was carried out by an American-born white guy, so it made no sense at all, and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. These paired laws created what I call Clinton's spiderweb. If you stayed too long, you were a criminal. If you left and tried to come back, you were a criminal. This was the catch-22 that led more immigrants overstaying their visas or just trying to evade border patrols entirely. The result? People stopped leaving. Because why would you risk never being able to return? The natural flow of migration was replaced with a trapped workforce living in constant fear. Thanks for that, Bill. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Everyone's freaking out about Trump's deportation promises, but here's the thing. He's actually going to have to work overtime and continue this pace to match Obama's numbers. Yeah, you heard that right. The deporter-in-chief presided over more formal removals than any previous administration. But Trump also wants to inflict maximum pain for maximum political gain and film the whole thing to strike fear into people's hearts. Now, if you hear anyone putting hard and fast numbers to what's happening in real time right now and extrapolating them to draw a firm conclusion or a projection, it's folly. There are a handful of numbers where we can stand behind, and Homeland has already indicated that it doesn't feel compelled to share data with the public, but here's what we know right now. So far, Homeland, which I'm using as a catch-all for Border Patrol and ICE, has claimed 969 arrests and 869 detentions on a single day. Okay? So compared to the most recent reports of a benchmark day in 2024 under Biden, this represents a 3 times increase in activity, presuming all of the people are going to be shown the door and not simply held indefinitely in detention centers. So if this number holds, which would be historic, then the Trump administration would theoretically be on pace to remove 1,800 people per week if they worked 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, which would put him ahead of Obama's height of around 1,200. All told, this would equal around 650,000 removals compared to 435,000 under Obama at his height in 2013. So, even still, this doesn't come close to hitting the promise of deporting millions, which we basically said in the lead up to Trump's inauguration. The sheer logistics behind deporting millions are nearly impossible unless they commit to quadrupling their efforts over this current shock and awe campaign. Now look, I'm not trying to downplay their efforts because they're winning the optics war while also tearing apart communities, especially in blue cities, and it's only going to get worse and uglier for a period of time. It will likely have the desired effect of chilling border crossing attempts as well, but not as much as it will when Trump drives the economy into the fucking ground and Latin American countries suddenly look a lot better in comparison, just like they did during the Obama years. The Migration Policy Institute tracks NIM throughout the world, and the stats for the U.S. are really interesting. Between 1970 and 1995, U.S. NIM was relatively stable with around 3 million net migrants every 5 years. Then it balloons starting in the mid-1990s after Clinton passed his draconian reforms. Even though it backed down post 9/11, the figures are still elevated in comparison at around 5 million over 5-year periods. Where all hell broke loose under Biden was post-pandemic and during the height of Venezuela's economic crisis. You see, the fact that Biden didn't address the root cause of Venezuelan migration and the surge in post-COVID asylum seekers due to multiple financial shocks in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, and China was a catastrophe. Their only solution was to continue the Title 42 expulsions that started under Trump, to close off the border and appoint Kamala Harris as the informal border czar armed with a knife at a gunfight. So if Biden didn't actually open the borders, and he was just as tough on immigration as Trump, and our restrictive laws haven't changed since the 1990s, then why and how did Biden lose control of the border and the narrative? Good questions all. We can't talk about immigration without talking about why people come here in the first place. Enter what is known as the Washington Consensus. Now, we did a full episode on it, which I'll link in the show notes. Essentially, we've treated our neighbors to the South as a commodity source. Labor, minerals, timber, oil, everything except treating them like a partner. We helped build economies on the other side of the planet while ignoring the potential of the LAC region to be more than a strip mine or a cheap labor pool. As we've said before, the Washington Consensus is a reflection of ethnocentric attitudes rather than a suite of policy prescriptions, and it's what contributes to the persistent narrative that these countries are filled with unproductive savages who want to suck on the teats of our welfare programs. We'll talk about welfare in a little bit. But the opportunities remain abundant and available if we only developed a more proactive and less racist attitude toward the region as a whole. And it looked for a moment during the global pandemic that we might wake up to the possibility of a true partnership, one that would ameliorate trade, reduce the flow of asylum seekers, and reduce carbon emissions. Sadly, the Biden administration ignored the opportunity even as the two largest economies in the LAC, Mexico and Brazil, moved further left and tried to open up more productive conversations throughout the region. No one represents this antiquated, paternalistic view of the Southern Hemisphere more than Joe Biden. Biden could have moved to normalize economic relations with Venezuela and eliminate sanctions that only serve to strengthen Maduro's authoritarian grip on the country while punishing its citizens. Conservatives bristle at the thought of being nice to a dictator, though, so it's a non-starter. Allow me to pause for dramatic effect. Even Democrats in the past, and yes, conservatives under Trump, want nothing to do with the dictator Maduro, while cozying up with Putin, Kim Jong-un, Javier Milei, Najib Bukele, and Viktor Orban. So what's the difference? Well, Venezuela's socialist, even if it's in name only. And they tell us to go fuck ourselves on a pretty routine basis. So we'll partner with murderous regimes all over the world, so long as they kiss our ring and kiss Trump's ass. Anyway, the crisis in Venezuela is a direct result of our punitive sanctions regime. That's what led to the surge in migration that led us to Trump, because that was an actual crisis of our own design. Biden could have also finished what Obama started in Cuba by minting it as a trading partner and opened up the flow of tourism. He could have partnered more closely with the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, in Mexico, and returning President Lula da Silva in Brazil to form an economic alliance that would reduce our dependence upon China. Instead, he did nothing. That left a vacuum that is once again being filled by the bloviator-in-chief, who's taking all the wrong lessons from the strongmen in the region and ignoring partnerships with our two most natural allies, who also happen to be the biggest trading partners and biggest democracies. Now, Trump once again designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, repeated his intention to implement punitive tariffs on Mexico, threatened Colombia, of all places, with sanctions after they refused to take a military plane of deported migrants who weren't even accused of crimes in the U.S. or Colombia, and is celebrating the brutal economic policies of Milei in Argentina and authoritarian policies of Bukele in El Salvador. Our policies and attitudes toward the LAC region are so short-sighted, racist, and depraved, it makes my blood boil. So in terms of who is being targeted in these roundups, the biggest threat I can see is in the characterization of criminality and status under the Trump regime. This is where it goes from business as usual to dictatorship-style pogroms. Consider the following scenarios. 1. About 35% of deportations ordered over the past decade were for people who didn't appear in court under a deportation order. So that goes back to Clinton's criminalization catch-22. This person might be the breadwinner for a family here, sends money back home, or is raising a kid on U.S. soil and is generally a productive citizen. Now, this person is also considered a criminal and might be rounded up by ICE. Number 2. There are 3 million people who have permission to work here, but no path to citizenship. These people are here under programs that can be killed at the discretion of the new administration. And these people are following the Homan's collateral damage roundups as we speak. And third, they might be legit criminals. They might be a member of a gang, wanted for a violent crime here in the United States or maybe in their home country. There are immigrants being targeted by ICE currently and historically that fall under this category, and this is the pretense under which this administration and most of Trumpland media is operating. A few good eggs will be swept up with these bad eggs, but that's the price we pay for freedom, right? I mean, this kind of aligns with what that young man at the top of the episode said as well. But let's dig into this part a bit more. Trump just signed the Lake and Riley Act, which would require ICE to also detain undocumented immigrants accused of a lesser nonviolent crime, which can include, by the way, not showing up for a court appearance because they were afraid of being deported and didn't know better, right? So there's a lot going on here. So let's take the undocumented person wanted for a crime in their home country. Assuming we have extradition privileges and communication with the nation of origin, this is a pretty straightforward path, right? Sure. Unless this person is a political prisoner who's wanted in their home country for protesting an authoritarian regime and demanding free and fair elections. Okay, well, I guess a proper procedure should be followed in this instance. But what about the undocumented immigrant that committed a crime on U.S. soil? Surely they should go, sure. Unless, of course, this person committed a crime that involves your family and they stand a much better chance of roaming free in their home country than they do facing our criminal justice system. I mean, wouldn't you want them tried here at home? Okay, well, the Lake and Riley Act adds a bit of clarity by adding nonviolent crimes, which basically just helps weed out the bad actors from our society. Surely there's no harm in that, right? Sure. Except for the part about only needing to be accused of a crime. See, in theory, you could press charges against someone you hold a grudge against for taking your parking spot at Trader Joe's. Now suddenly they're in the system and ICE is knocking on the door to deport them. So because you lost your parking spot at Trader Joe's and decided to make a false accusation against someone you don't know, and it turns out they're undocumented, they're leaving the country. But this person is also the provider for an entire family, working nights and weekends in jobs that Americans won't fill, sending money home to El Salvador so the rest of their family doesn't seek asylum in the United States. And one of the jobs they have is as caretaker to an old disabled lady whose kids don't live in the same state. So they pay this person off the books because her insurance doesn't cover the cost of an aid. And since ICE swept this person up and the old lady wasn't notified, she goes 3 days without eating, gets dizzy, falls down, hits her head, and dies. Now the family in El Salvador falls into complete crisis, and the entire family has to flee the country, but they're too weak and hungry, and so they die in the desert while their father rots in a cell in Guantanamo Bay. Everyone died in this scenario because you had to park 3 spots closer to Trader fucking Joe's. Way to go, asshole. Point being, this level of nuance isn't being discussed anywhere, so it's important for us not to add to the confusion by getting it wrong. Now, before we go, we should reinforce some facts that we've covered before to demolish some right-wing bullshit. Now, you've heard this all before. Immigrants are flooding across the borders to take advantage of our free social services. Let's see which programs they're talking about. Do they get Medicaid? Nope. Medicare? Nope. Temporary aid to needy families or TANF? Nuh-uh. Childcare? Nope. Adoption assistance? Low-income home energy assistance? No. SNAP food benefits? No. Social Security? Please. No. But get this. Undocumented workers pay about $13 billion a year into Social Security that they'll never be able to claim. They also pay property taxes through rent and sales tax on goods they buy. The one thing that they can do is access health care through emergency rooms, but they also get bills for that, and there's ways to collect money on that. But I'm going to address health care in a separate episode. So what we're really talking about is public education. Let's be honest. But here's the deal. Public schools are primarily funded by local property taxes. These are paid by homeowners and landlords. Tenants pay these homeowners for apartments and rooms, and landlords for apartments and storefronts. So if an immigrant pays rent, it de facto covers the public school funding. See how this works? So that leaves school lunches. And on this point, I have to concede. Undocumented children receive school lunches, and the federal government is on the hook for that. So let's do a little math. The federal government spends about $17.2 billion on school lunches, and about 7% of students are undocumented. So that is $1.2 billion per year feeding undocumented children. Now, the federal budget for 2025 is around $7.3 trillion. So that means that school lunches for undocumented children represents 0.016% of the federal budget. Well, since you put it that way, deport them all. These right-wing talking points are garbage, and the media outlets that repeat them are garbage outlets filled with garbage people. But as leftists, we don't get to pick and choose our facts that support our narratives either. And look, I get it. We need to call out Trump's cruelty, his racist rhetoric, his intentional trauma infliction. But we also need to be honest about something. The difference between Trump and Obama or Biden is in the cruelty of execution, but not in numbers. If we're going to build coalitions and align on policy, the left needs to be morally consistent here. Yes, Trump's approach is more brutal, more racist, more intentionally cruel. But the machinery that he's using, that was built and maintained by both parties. Clinton criminalized existence. Bush militarized the border. Obama perfected deportation, and Biden used it all and then some. And Trump just took off the mask. The real solution isn't in who can deport more people or build bigger walls. It's in recognizing that the entire framework is broken. We need to rebuild our relationship with Latin America and the Caribbean, create real economic partnerships, decriminalize immigrant status, and stop treating people like political footballs. But that does require both parties admitting that they have blood on their hands. And in Washington, that's the one thing that's still illegal. Here endeth the lesson.